Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Charlie Arnot, CEO of the Center for Food Integrity, and it is my distinct pleasure this afternoon to welcome you to our webinar on key drivers to consumer acceptance of ag and food technology. We have record interest in this topic. More than 600 people have registered, and we see them coming in now. We want to welcome each and every one of you. All of this is possible only through the support of the United Soybean Board, and I'm so pleased today to have Jeff Magyar, a soybean farmer and a board member of the United Soybean Board, with us to offer a welcome. And Jeff, I'll turn it over to you.
Yes. Hello, I'm Jeff Magyar. A soybean farmer from Ohio. I serve on the United Soybean Board and the board of the Center for Food Integrity. As a farmer, I know sustainability is on the top of minds of consumers, especially younger generations who look to us to produce food in the most sustainable way. As a third-generation family farmer, I can tell you sustainability is always on the top of my mind and every farmer I know. And technologies like precision ag, crop protection, and gene editing allows us to produce more food sustainably each day. That's why today's webinar is so very important. If consumers reject the technologies to grow safe, abundant crops and raise healthy animals, we will be hard pressed to produce food required to feed a growing population. In fact, latest research shows agriculture needs to expand by 60% to meet global demand in 2050. That's a tall order. We can get there, but it will likely take continuous innovation to move forward. That's why I'd like to introduce Charlie, the Center for Food Integrity, to identify the driving factors for consumer acceptance or rejection of new technologies. Thank you again, and Charlie.
Great, Jeff, thank you so much, and I appreciate you taking time, especially during harvest, to spend a little time with us today and help kick off the webinar, and for the continued support of you and the rest of the board members and all of the soybean farmers who've made this work possible. I want to provide a little bit of context before we kind of jump into the data. This is part of a continuum of work that we're doing on technology acceptance with the support of the United Soybean Board. It began with some qualitative focus groups, consumer focus groups. We've now done this groundbreaking quantitative research. And over the next year, we will be engaging with more than 60 food system leaders to better understand what are their expectations for technology and what will encourage those in the food system who oftentimes serve as the gatekeeper for technology to be more supportive of the technology that's necessary for agriculture to continue to produce the food we need using fewer natural resources. Now, the research today is based on a model that we'll talk about in a moment. And we identified 4 specific technologies to test, but the technologies are really just illustrations in the model. What we really wanted to be able to do is, can we identify a model that helps us better understand what are the drivers for acceptance or rejection of technology? And to do that, we had to pick some technology that there was some consumer awareness. So we've got gene-edited plants and gene-edited animals. We have plant-based alternatives to animal protein, and we have lab-grown alternatives or cultured alternatives to animal proteins. So we'll provide some insight into those specific technologies, but I want to remind you, and I'll remind you again once we get to them, those were simply used as a way to provide some context for the broader model, because ideally what we want to be able to do is understand beyond those 4 technologies what is actually going to drive consumer acceptance and consumer rejection going forward. So let's jump into this specific project and kind of the background and objectives. Again, we're developing a model to classify existing and upcoming technology in agriculture and the key factors that drive acceptance of those technologies. So we've got several aspects of the technology, consumer values, as well as other attributes that help us better understand exactly what is going to drive acceptance. And then we'll use this model to help develop communication, education strategies, to assist those who are developing technology to bring that technology to market in a way that will help build support. So ideally, this information will be used by those who are developing technology to better understand how can they introduce the technology in a way that builds trust, builds acceptance, and gives the tools that farmers need to produce the food we need more sustainably, as Jeff noted in his opening remarks. You can see the sample plan, 260 different interviews, about 15 minutes apiece. Again, we broke them into 2 different blocks. So half of the interviews focused on gene-edited plants and gene-edited animals. The other half of the interviews focused on plant-based alternatives to conventional animal protein and cultured alternatives to conventional animal proteins. So we'll get into all the details about that, but we did want to start with a little bit about the model and kind of understand what's the model that we're using, because there is no easy button here in terms of technology acceptance, but there is a process going forward. And to kind of foreshadow the results, what we've seen is the model is highly, highly predictive. So once we get to the acceptance of technology, we have R-squareds between 0.72 and 0.84, which are very high for social science and really indicate that whether the technology is accepted or rejected, these elements that you see here on the screen, and we'll spend some more time talking about, are highly predictive in terms of helping us to understand what is truly going to drive technology. So I'm going to spend a little more time talking about this. And this was built on work done by Seacrest and Hartman in the European Union that was published in the June 2020 issue of Nature Food. So we're building on work that was done by them. One of the questions that came in earlier as people were sending in questions prior to the webinar is, are there variations across countries? And the answer is absolutely, because culture influences technology acceptance. But what we can understand from all of these different elements in the model is, how might this individual element in the model be interpreted differently about this specific technology or in this specific culture? So again, as we go through this, I want you to stay focused on what can we learn from the model, not just what did we learn about these 4 specific technologies. So I want to spend some time kind of going through each of the elements in the model to help you understand the complexity, but also the path forward in building technology acceptance. So voluntary exposure, that's about the need for choice. Consumers are looking for information so they can make informed decisions. If we don't give them that information, it triggers outrage. And I can just relate back to a series of consumer focus groups we did several years ago around GMOs. And what we learned was that when consumers became aware that they've been consuming GMOs for years without their knowledge, they were outraged by that. So they want the ability to have that choice. I want to be able to decide whether or not that's something that I want to ingest. Perceived naturalness. So that needs to match my perception of the natural world. Now, that's, again, another one of those that could be influenced by culture. If you are more accustomed to and comfortable with technology, that can be fine. But it also is complicated somewhat when we begin to talk about the role of animals, because the role of animals is more complex in our society. So when we talk about perceived naturalness, the complex role that animals play, again, both as companions and sources of food, creates a deep emotional response. And so when we begin to think about modifying animals, there's a different level of concern and dis-ease. Perceived dread. This is all about food that I'm going to ingest. And one of the things that we saw consistently throughout the research is, if it is about food that I'm going to put in my body or in the body of people that I love, my children, then I have a higher level of concern than if it's technology that's going to be used for other purposes. So if I'm talking about drones or precision agriculture and it doesn't actually impact food, then I'm significantly less concerned, more willing to accept that technology. But once it gets to products that I'm going to put into my body or feed to my family, my level of concern goes up, and that's where perceived dread comes into the equation. What are the potential long-term impacts? That's one of the things we have to think about as we have that conversation. Now, perceived control also goes back to and is related to voluntary exposure. I want to have the power to control the decisions that I'm going to make about what I eat or what I don't eat. And it's related to perceived helplessness. If you make me helpless in this situation, I'm not going to be very happy about it. And I'm not going to be willing to accept that technology because of my growing concern about what it could potentially do and my lack of ability to control whether I consume it or others in my family consume it. So those are the technology aspects. We're going to drop down now into the consumer aspects, and we get to discuss sensitivity. This is kind of an innate, just kind of visceral response to something that you think is gross. So think about pink slime or think about other topics that really trigger a strong emotional reaction. This is going to be tied to your individual personality, your cultural experience, and your basic expectations. Next, we have attitudes toward new technology. Some people are simply more willing to accept new technology. Others are more reticent to new technology. Do they view technology in their lives as a driver of solutions or as a source of anxiety? And we're all inundated with more technology, more applications of technology today. So on one hand, it can make us more comfortable with technology. But on the other hand, if it's something that makes me uncomfortable, I'm going to feel slightly overwhelmed by that. And it's going to create anxiety because I don't truly understand the technology and I'm not all that accepting of technology in general. Cultural values, these are kind of the cultural norms that you grew up with, your belief of what's right. We know that values are the driver for trust. So my cultural values are going to truly influence what drives my trust in this. Is this good? Is it bad? And in the current environment, we tend to have highly polarized perspectives on cultural values as it relates to a number of different topics. And then personal identification. Can I identify with this? Is it consistent with my self-image? And will it impact how I am perceived by others? So if I'm someone who likes to purchase food at an organic food store and I carry my bags with me and I put photos of Instagram on me doing those kinds of things that I perceive to be more natural, that's part of my personal identification. So will the technology then be consistent with that, or will it be inconsistent with that? On the flip side of that, if I'm someone who embraces technology, I like to try new things, the technology may be very well aligned with my personal identification. But the personal identification plays a role in the acceptance. Now we move to the larger green box there, kind of in the middle. We're talking about the mental shortcuts or heuristics that we use. All of us use heuristics. They're nothing more than the cultural or social shortcuts we take to form opinions on topics or issues where we really don't spend the time to get in-depth information. That's how we kind of form those first impressions. Now, the first one are images associated with the technology, affect heuristics. So affect has an impact on your emotions. So fear, pleasure, anger, surprise, all of those things are going to play into the affect heuristic. And what does this technology trigger for me almost immediately as a first impression? The second one, the belief that natural is better and that previous products are better. This again ties back to that potential anxiety about things that are unfamiliar or perceived to be unnatural. And it creates that emotional response that I'm going to be concerned about it to the technology because it's just something that is less familiar and is less comfortable for me. And because, again, of all the technology that comes into our lives, the speed at which we're trying to address that. Now, finally, under the heuristics, we've got the trust heuristic. Now, this is the foundation of this model because it's all about that level of building trust. And the trust heuristic is tied to a couple of things. First of all, it's trust in people and the organizations. So it's trust in the individuals who are developing the technology. Is someone willing to stand up and step up and have a conversation with me about that? Are they going to stand behind it? What about the organization? Is the company trustworthy? Do they have a track record of operating with integrity and credibility? Are they willing to be open and transparent with me? What about the third-party organizations that are validating the technology or those that are in the regulatory position? Can we transfer the credibility of those third-party organizations or of a regulatory agency or from some trusted individual to the specific technology? That's the whole trust piece of that, and it's got to be a key element as we move forward. Then moving forward into the perceived risk of adopting the technology, obviously the risk has to be less than the perceived benefit, but again, there are a couple of different ways to think about the risk. Is it a risk to me and my family, something I'm going to ingest, or is it more externalized? Is this a risk to the environment or something else that I care about, but doesn't carry the same amount of emotional weight as something that's going to impact me and my family? Similarly, on the perceived benefits, the benefits could be very important to me because they're going to be better for me. I'm going to have longer shelf life. The product's going to be more nutritious, whatever it happens to be. But there can also be benefits to other things that are really important to me. Jeff mentioned sustainability. Well, more and more people are concerned about the impact of food production on our planet. And so as we are concerned about that, how do we have a better conversation about the benefits and be transparent about the perceived risk so people can come to the conclusion for themselves with voluntary information about their perspective and what they are willing to accept or not accept as it comes to new technology. So as we go through these different models, what you will see is either a positive or a negative response to the individual technologies based on the individual aspects. So either the technology aspects, the consumer characteristics, or the heuristics, the perceived risk or the perceived benefit. Now, the methodology was we offered people a variety of different statements that would reflect voluntary exposure, perceived dread, perceived control, positive or negative heuristics. And they rated their level of agreement with that particular statement with that specific technology. And from that, we can begin to understand what's it going to take to demonstrate effective voluntary exposure, or the natural is better heuristic, or cultural values, or overcome the disgust sensitivity. So again, think about this model and the illustration simply as a tool for us to better understand how we can apply the model to technology going forward. So the entire research report is 281 pages. I'm able to just share with you today a thumbnail summary of that, but there's a great deal of additional information that we'd welcome the opportunity to continue to share with you if you're interested in learning more about how this can apply to your specific technology. We also spent a little bit of time asking about perceptions of U.S. agriculture and technology used to grow food, just kind of as a basic framework, just a platform, a foundation for our opening conversation. And what we see is that nearly 2 out of 3 have a very positive or somewhat positive of U.S. agriculture today. That's great news. And millennials and early adopters are more positive. One of the things that I found very encouraging about this research is that Gen Z, millennials, and early adopters tended to be more accepting of all the different technologies and the models that we put forward. Why is that important? Well, first, for Gen Z and millennials, they see technology as empowering important solutions to solve societal problems. So they're more willing to embrace the use of technology to solve some of these challenges. And early adopters are the opinion leaders in any social system. So it's really important that they are engaged in this conversation. And the fact that they come to this conversation with generally a more positive perception of agriculture is a great place for us to begin. Nearly 2 out of 3, again, close to the same percentage, believe that they know a little or a lot about U.S. agriculture. And again, millennials and early adopters claim to be more knowledgeable. Now, the self-assessment of knowledge obviously varies from person to person. I can talk about this much with soybean harvesting. Jeff knows this much about soybean harvesting, but I might say I know a little. Jeff might say I would know very little, right? But this is self-perception in terms of how I'm going to rate myself in terms of what I know or believe that I know about a particular topic. Nearly 2 out of 3 have a very positive or somewhat impression of the use of technology to grow food in the U.S. today. Now, that's a great starting place for us to begin the conversation. But what you will see is that varies significantly by the specific technology. And we don't have time to share all the data today, but what we saw was in terms of kind of the initial reaction and initial support for these technologies, it's quite varied. Based on a number of the various factors that we identified. But here's the key. Knowing which factors triggered people to be more accepting or less accepting means we have a pathway forward. We can go to that specific factor and say, okay, if this is driving acceptance or if this is inhibiting acceptance, how do we have a conversation around this specific topic and this specific factor in a way that results in greater trust? And just over half believe they know a lot about, or at least have a little about U.S. agriculture and the use of technology to grow food in the U.S. So again, a very positive thing, a very positive place for us to go as we think about moving forward in this conversation. Now, here's one, it's a bit of a coin toss, right? Just about half believe the food system is moving in the right direction, which means just about half believe it's moving on the wrong track. So it's pretty evenly divided. But again, Gen Z, millennial, and early adopters are more likely to believe the food system is headed in the right direction. And that's a great thing because it is the next generation of consumers and those who are opinion leaders that are more likely to believe the food system is headed in the right direction. Okay, so we're going to transition now and begin to have the conversation about acceptance of specific technologies. And again, just as a reminder, we chose these technologies just as illustrations for helping us to prove whether or not the model could predict what drives technology acceptance. we had to use technologies that had some level of consumer awareness. So we chose gene editing and alternatives to animal protein because there is some level of awareness in our culture today about those technologies. But this is less about the specific technologies and more about the model as we continue to think about how we're going to go forward. So again, let's go forward and talk about the gene editing of plants before we jump in then to the gene editing of animals and some of the other technology. And again, we shared this model before. And just to reiterate our process, we gave people specific statements for each of these different elements: voluntary exposure, perceived naturalness, et cetera, all the way through the model. We asked them to rate their level of agreement based on a description of the technology. We also asked for them to give us their initial impression of the technology. Is it favorable, neutral, or negative? And with gene editing in plants, it was generally favorable to neutral. So that's a positive place for us to begin the conversation, specifically when it comes to the gene editing of plants. What we saw with the gene editing of animals was it was generally more negative. Because again, we tend to anthropomorphize, we assign human characteristics to animals, and we have a complicated cultural relationship with animals. So people are less comfortable with technology being applied to animal agriculture than they are to plant agriculture. So that's a great place to start, right? We begin to understand that the belief in natural is better has a bigger driver when it comes to gene editing in animals versus gene editing in plants. So we'll kind of walk through that. But again, all of this is designed to provide some keys for us to continue to use to unlock the right combination to build that level of trust in technology. So as we go through this, what you can see is that the voluntary exposure or control, do people have information to allow them to determine whether or not they can consume these products? That was a negative result. Perceived naturalness is interesting because it was positive for gene editing in plants. And oftentimes that can be achieved or encouraged by using analogies. This is like that. If you understand this and you're okay with this, then you might be okay with that. Now, that being said, analogies have to be credible, they have to be believable, and they've got to pass the sniff test, right? And they've got to be credible enough and logical enough to say, okay, I can see how you use that technology in a way that it is similar to something I'm already more comfortable with, so I can be more comfortable with this. Consumer characteristics, very low discussed sensitivity for gene edited plants, and attitude toward the technology, very positive. So in terms of the mental shortcuts, again, kind of first impression, negative for the affect heuristics in terms of the initial emotional response, negative in terms of the natural is better heuristic, but not as negative as the one for gene edited animals. And then the trust in people or organization, a positive result, because we can refer to the credibility of industry organizations, third-party organizations, and government organizations that provide oversight of technology development and approval. So then you can see the perceived risk of adopting the technology, very positive, the perceived benefits of the technology, positive, leading to a positive result for the acceptance of the technology. 31% strongly agree, 24% strongly disagree with the statement, I trust food produced using gene edited plants. So now we're going to go to kind of the statistical analysis, looking at the regression analysis and understanding what are the drivers that gave us an R squared of 0.84, which is extremely high in social science research. Anything above 0.3 is considered publishable. So these are really high results for this particular modeling. So what we see in terms of the beta coefficients that really drive acceptance, the first one is eating food containing gene edited plants is safe for consumers. Now, one of the things we'll have to better understand as we continue to go forward is for people to understand it may not be the specific gene edited plant or animal that you're consuming. That might be several generations prior to the food that's actually made its way to market. So we have to be able to help people understand the gene edited genetic heritage of some of these products and figure out better ways to have that conversation as well. Second tier drivers, gene editing of plants promotes greater sustainability of food through higher crop yields. So again, making that connection between productivity and sustainability. Confidence in the techniques because it's used in human medicine. This is something that we identified earlier as having a lot of potential as well. The use of gene editing in human medicine carries a great deal of credibility in helping to build support for it in other uses as well. And then your third tier drivers is available to all farmers and growers. So people like the democratized access. Information is available so consumers can know when they're purchasing food from gene-edited plants. And all things considered, naturally grown plants are better than plants that have been gene-edited. That's a negative impact. So that's still a driver. So when people are considering everything in total, what's better, the more natural or the gene edited? Well, we'll probably lean more toward the natural. So again, a good key. There's one of the opportunities for us to figure out more effective strategies to overcome some of those biases. So the primary messages should include drivers of trust in food produced from gene edited plants in terms of food safety. Messages should focus on perceived benefits of the technology, naturalness of the technology, food safety, the trust heuristics. Messages to overcome negative perceptions, long-term food safety, availability of information, the naturalness heuristic, technology equity for all, and the company profit motivations. And this one's important because people want to make sure that companies that are involved in technology development acknowledge the fact that, yes, they have a profit motivation, but they also need to be able to be willing to engage the public and talk about their public interest obligations as well. That's where we've got to continue to move forward in this conversation, that it's not just about profit, it's about making sure we balance profit and public interest. Primary targets, again, very exciting that it's early adopters. They tend to be more positive. Again, they are the opinion leaders. They can help reduce the risk for others. Millennials and Gen Z, it's great that this group of consumers are interested and willing to see the value of the technology. And then consumers in the West, interesting, have a more positive and progressive view. And we spent some time trying to dive into that. Why might that be the case? We don't know. We don't know why, but it is, in fact, the case. So in terms of trust building, again, this is how we begin to take the model and we begin to now apply it to a specific technology. What kind of information do we want to share? What types of sources and information will build trust? Independent research on the safety, readily available information on which products include gene-edited plants, third-party audit or some kind of independent oversight of the process and the companies that are using it and developing it, independent research on the safety for food animal consumption. And then here's another really key piece that I think we can leverage going forward, information access and delivery. And you'll see this as we go further. People are interested in getting information from a variety of sources today. And that's good news for us. Because there's been a lot of conversation about, well, should it be on a label or should it not be on a label? That's up to the individual marketers to determine. But we do know that there are food manufacturers that are concerned about how much space they have on a label and how are they going to best use that space. Because the number of issues consumers have more interest in continues to grow, and they aren't able to list all of the topics that may be relevant to a specific consumer. So are there different ways to engage consumers and give them access information so that they can have that control? And the answer is absolutely yes. So whether it's on the package from an independent third-party website, government website, on an app, what you'll see is that people are willing to look forward and be able to see all the different places that they can get information. So we don't have to just pick one place. We need to make sure we're providing information in a variety of different ways that consumers can access it. Okay, gene editing of animals, again, the exact same model. And what you'll see here is more red than green. Voluntary exposure, again, negative, perceived red, negative, discuss sensitivity, positive result. Attitude toward this more new technology was more negative. Similar for all of the heuristics. But remember, we also started with a much more negative initial perception of gene editing in animals than we did with gene editing in plants. Perceived risk of adopting the technology, perceived benefit of the technology, essentially the same. So people were equally divided on that. But overall, 30% strongly disagreed that they would trust food produced using gene-edited animals, while only 24% strongly agreed that they would support it. So 30% strongly disagreed, 24% strongly agreed that they would trust food produced using gene-edited animals. Now, again, this is less about this specific technology, but what can the model teach us? What can we do to go back into each of these individual aspects and better understand how does that apply? And how can we then apply that to a new specific technology coming forward? So that's the goal of this whole exercise, is to really understand how can we take this knowledge and apply it more broadly across a variety of technologies. Again, you can see an R-squared of 0.82, very, very high. The top tier driver, is it safe? Eating food from food production animals that have been gene edited is safe for consumers. That's the number one concern, the top driver for acceptance. Second tier, gene-edited food production animals is beneficial farming practice because it can help ensure a consistent supply of food. So again, kind of a takeoff on the sustainability piece, but we can have enough for all by using this technology. And then the third tier, information is readily available. I have confidence in the techniques because they're used in human medicine. And again, biotech companies are only motivated by profit. So you can begin to see some of the consistent themes emerging, which is wonderful, because that gives us some clarity and some direction about how do we begin to focus our time and attention to leverage this model and what we've learned through the research in applying it to other technologies. So primary messages, again, focused on food safety, consistent supply of food, the information availability, and the trust heuristic. Messages to reinforce those who are positive or neutral toward the technology should focus on the perceived naturalness and the benefits of the technology, like creating consistent food supply and how it actually can enhance animal welfare by reducing disease and premature death. And then messages to overcome the negative perception should focus on educating consumers on the benefits of the technology. Again, great news, early adopters, millennials, Gen Z, and Gen X, much more willing to be engaged in this information, much more interested and more likely to be supportive, and again, consumers in the West. So we're beginning to identify what messages, what topics, what issues, who are the primary targets. And then finally, again, thinking about this, what sources of information are actually going to help us? And again, independent research, third-party research, independent research on safety of the food produced using gene-edited animals, also independent research on the safety of gene-edited animals for human consumption over time, and the overall third-party oversight of food companies and the impact of food produced from gene-edited animals on consumer health. But again, information access, we gave people several different options and all of them ranked relatively high. Depending on the specific topic, we had 2 or 3 that were essentially equal, which tells us people are using a variety of channels to get their information. No surprise. So we need to be in all of those different channels, but it means we have various options available to us to connect with consumers in a meaningful way. Okay, so now we're going to transition from the gene editing. Again, that's just an illustration to help us prove the model to 2 other types of technologies, alternatives to conventional animal protein, to see what we can learn from these technologies as it relates to how this potential model can be applied. Again, the same work, the same exact model was applied. One set of consumers looked at gene editing, one set of consumers looked at alternatives to conventional animal protein, but the model was consistent across all 4 technologies, so we can better understand how the model can be applied to future technologies as well. So what we see here is a slightly positive acceptance of the technology. You can see voluntary exposure and control is higher here. We have positive result. Part of that goes to the fact that there's been a lot of marketing. There's been a lot of messaging. There's been a lot of communication about plant-based alternatives to conventional animal protein. So people are able to see on the label of their product that this is plant-based. They're able to see advertisings from quick service restaurants and others that are offering plant-based alternatives. So they feel more control. They feel like this is a voluntary decision. And as a result of that, they're more comfortable with the technology, because I can choose whether I want a plant-based alternative or not, because it's disclosed to me. I have access to that information. Perceived dread, negative results, are still some concern about long-term impacts. Disgust sensitivity, positive result, not a high level of disgust, and positive attitude toward the new technology. People see a lot of potential benefits with this technology. Again, not that they're giving up conventional meat, but they are interested in what are the potential benefits of plant-based alternatives. The affect heuristics, the positive or negative images, positive, again, as a result probably of all the communication we've seen. Natural is better. This is a negative result as people realize there's a lot of processing that can go on to bring plant-based alternatives to market. And then trust in the people organizations is high, again, partly because of the communication, the willingness to engage, the openness to being transparent about what's happening, and the promotion of those specific products. So overall, you see a slightly positive result with 26% strongly agreeing that they trust technology used to create plant-based meat, and 23% strongly agreeing with that. So you still have roughly 50% in the middle that are still kind of making up their mind about whether they should or should not be supportive. So here you see a slightly lower R-squared of 0.71, but again, still very high for social science research. The top tier drivers: improved nutritional content, leads to reduced risk for human disease. So that's a message that's resonating well today. This helps reduce the risk of disease. Eating plant-based meat is safe for consumers. Plant-based meat is better for the environment since it requires less land to produce than conventional meat. So those are kind of the top three drivers. Second tier, plant-based meat allows the industry to meet global food demand. And those were the two tiers that we saw there. And we'll kind of go into the messaging as we continue to go forward. Okay, messaging, primary messages should include the key drivers of trust in the technology used to create plant-based meat, improve nutrition, food safety, benefits to the environment, meeting global food demand, information availability. Again, people want to make absolutely certain they have access to information and can make the decisions that are best for them based on that. Information availability, as we said, messages to overcome negative perception should focus on educating consumers on the benefits of the technology. And then the primary targets, again, early adopters, Gen Z and millennials. And I can't overemphasize how great that is, that these are the target audiences, because these are the groups that are more willing to engage in technology, use technology, and see the benefits of technologies to solve specific problems. So a really good opportunity. So for trust building on plant-based alternatives to animal protein, independent research on the safety for human consumption of plant-based meat over time, access to information from independent third parties, having ready access to detailed information about plant-based meat. And again, all the different sources where people are going for information, it can be very, very helpful. So, okay, so we've got a lot of good questions coming in. We had some more that came in before, so keep them coming in. We'll get to as many of those as we possibly can before we wrap it up today. Now, cultured meat is very interesting. We saw the most negative response initially and then overall to cultured meat. And again, we're not talking specifically about this technology, but the goal here is what can we learn from this technology and what can we learn from consumers' response to this technology that we can apply more broadly to technology acceptance. Just reinforcing, same model was used in all four different models, all four different technologies. But here you can see virtually everything was a negative result, that consumers just were not positive. And you can see 40% strongly disagreed that they trust the technology used to create cultured meat. Only 18% strongly agreed. The disgust sensitivity, again, kind of that visceral reaction, was pretty high for this particular technology. People had a stronger emotional negative reaction to it. They're not confident that this is a natural product. They believe natural is better. They don't believe this actually fits into that definition. So there were a lot of compounding factors here that led to the outcome. But what's interesting then is how can we go back and understand each one of these individual aspects as it relates to this technology, and then how do we apply that for other technologies as we continue to move forward? So again, this one's R squared of 0.72, so still very high. Top driver is top beta coefficient is eating cultured meat is safe for consumers, 0.493. Second tier, since cultured meat involves using cells from living animals to produce meat, it's a natural process. So there we were able to say, again, because living animals are using cells to produce meat, this is using cells to produce meat, this is like that. Right? So it's a way to be able to use that naturalness concept and to use an analogy to begin to help encourage that acceptance and understanding. Third tier driver, information on cultural meat is readily available. So look at the difference here between what we saw with the plant-based, because it is very, very, it's marketed extensively. We see lots of communication around it. This is not there yet. Confidence in the techniques because it's used in human medicine. Again, that's going to be a key driver. And then the last one, the negative one, I'm disgusted at the thought of eating cultured meat. So this was the only place where we saw the culture characteristic, the disgust characteristic, the disgust sensitivity come through as a driver. But it really did come through for cultured meat. Primary messages should include key drivers in terms of safety, food safety, natural process, and access to information. Information is available. Messages to overcome the negative perception should focus on the benefits of the technology, and we really have to address that disgust sensitivity. And again, early adopters, Gen Z, Gen X, West and Northeast this time, which is interesting, are more likely to be accepting. But early adopters, those are the opinion leaders in every subset of culture, so it's important to engage with them. Gen Z and Gen X, much more likely to see technology as a solution for a lot of serious problems we have in our world, so they're more likely to be willing to embrace technology, which is a wonderful thing. And then the kind of information, independent research on the safety for human consumption of cultured meat over time, access to information from independent third-party audits of food companies regarding the potential impact of eating cultured meat on your health, independent research on the nutritional value of cultured meat, having ready access to detailed information about cultured meat. So public expectations for information about technology use. We just picked one of these. We've got them for all 4 technologies. But this is where consumers likely to go for information about the specific technology. This is all, again, about that voluntary exposure and control. If you expect me to embrace your technology, I need to know when it's going to be used in the food I might be consuming, and I want to be able to make the choice about whether or not I purchase that food. But look at what's interesting in this. Essentially, you've got information on the food product packaging and an independent third-party website, essentially equal. Well, this is for gene-edited plants. You can see it for gene-edited animals. For plant-based meat alternatives, more likely to want it on the food packaging. For a cell-based, you can see there it's virtually equal again. But the takeaway from this, from our perspective, is that there are lots of channels that consumers are going to use and want to use to get information about ag technology and whether or not it's something they're likely to accept. But the key here is they want access to that information. So whether we put it on a third-party website, we put it on a package, it's on a government website, it's on an app, whatever it happens to be, we know that consumers expect to have access to that information so they can make an informed decision about whether or not they want to buy products that have gene-edited ingredients in them. So what are some of the strategic considerations as we begin to kind of wrap up and then transition over to questions? Kind of looking at the pyramid of where we build all the way up to acceptance. Again, ready access to information. I've got to have access to be able to determine if this is something that's right for me and my family. If you don't give me that access to information, I'm much more likely to reject your technology. Positive perceptions that the edible end product is safe for consumers to ingest and that it is natural, however we define natural. And this is, again, where analogies can be helpful. Then we move up to the heuristics, the shortcuts in decision-making. Trust in the organizations that approve and monitor the impact of the technologies is key. Now, for some technologies, there's regulatory oversight. For other technologies, there is evolving regulatory oversight, but there could also be market oversight or other independent third-party oversight. But that kind of oversight is important, as well as trust in the organizations themselves who are developing the technology. What problem are you solving? Why are you choosing this technology? Why this technology over another option? Continuing to engage in that conversation and providing that level of transparency is absolutely essential to build that level of trust in the technology. And the benefits of the technology have to outweigh the perceived risk of using or ingesting it. And ultimately, ag technologies have a greater opportunity for acceptance if they score positively along the key drivers of trust, safety, and the food that's going to be derived from that technology. But what the model shows us is there are many different paths to get there, and there are many different variables and aspects and characteristics that we have to address if we're going to be successful in introducing it. So just kind of a final summary here, acceptance of ag technology can be highly dependent upon whether or not the output of the technology is ingested by consumers. So if this is something I'm going to eat or it's going to impact my food, I have a higher level of concern and I'm going to set the bar higher in terms of my access to information, data on whether or not it's going to be safe, its perceived naturalness. All of those things are going to carry greater importance if this ties to something that I'm actually going to eat. It's also dependent on the tangible nature of the output. Is it visible? So plant-based meat, for example, you can go to your local burger restaurant and you can see, I can get a plant-based patty. That's highly visible. I have the choice. I have the information. I can make that decision. Therefore, I'm more likely. Now, ingredients aren't as visible. So how do you provide information about ingredients in the food system? So again, I can make that decision and make a determination about whether or not this is technology I choose to support. And it's also dependent upon the degree to which it challenges cultural norms. So, for example, we know that meat is a really important part of our culture. We're heading into the holiday season where turkey and ham is likely to be a part of the diet for many of us, and it carries a special affinity. Similarly with grilling and other kinds of activities. So we need to be aware of what are the cultural norms that may be challenged by the introduction of this technology, if any. If they aren't likely to be challenged, then we're more likely to see acceptance. One of the other cultural norms is pets are animals as pets, animals as companions. Well, how does that make me feel about the technology that's being used in animal agriculture? So all of those understandings of what are the cultural norms as it relates to this specific technology can be very helpful in making a decision. And as I just noted, again, we still have that tendency to anthropomorphize animals, assign human characteristics to them, which makes it more challenging for ag technology that involves changing animals, such as gene editing. So that's the end of the formal remarks. The questions are pouring in. Thank you so much for this. We also have some that came in earlier. So I'm going to do my very best to get to as many of these as I possibly can. And some of these I'm not going to have time to, but would love to provide more information on these later. As I said, we've got 281 slides with lots of detail. So we'll have to be able to kind of parse that out over time, but we welcome that conversation. What consumers say they will do and their actual purchasing behavior not always align. How can one account for those potential differences in the model, or do price points fit in the model? Great question. So I might be, there's a huge distinction between my willingness to be supportive of a technology and my willingness to buy something from the technology. There's a very low correlation between stated purchasing intent and actual purchasing behavior. But that doesn't mean, even if I'm not going to buy it, or I am going to buy it, that I'm not going to be supportive or less supportive of the technology. So we need to kind of separate those two in terms of, am I going to buy it, or am I going to be supportive of this technology coming to market? So even if I'm going to be supportive of the technology coming to market, I need to know that it's going to be consistent with my values, with my cultural expectations, and all the other attributes and characteristics that we outlined here. So I might be willing to say, you go ahead and decide if you're going to buy it, but I'm still not comfortable with it. And I'm going to talk about it on social media. I'm going to share that my impression with my friends, et cetera. So a lot of that continues to evolve over time. There were 600 plus, I believe, interviewed in the survey. That was one question. How lasting are the impressions? Many participants had existing perceptions of the technologies, responded to messaging in the study, but what happens when consumers are receiving many different messages from many sources? Great question. Probably the best technology that we saw that's an illustration of that would be the plant-based alternatives to traditional meat. One of the things that we know is that there's been a significant amount of resource spent in marketing and communicating around plant-based alternatives. So we began to see people internalize some of those messages, that there's a perception that these are healthier, that they're going to have less negative impact on personal health than animal-based products. That they are able to be produced more sustainably than animal-based products, that I have access to information about whether or not this product is included in something that I am eating because of all the marketing. So the point is well taken. We can absolutely change impressions based on engagement. And I think it's important to note with this model, words are the tools we have to shape perception. What we know is that choosing the right tool for the job is going to be crucially important. So that's by going into greater detail around each of the technologies, and then what can we learn about that to apply to other technologies will be absolutely essential for us as we continue to go forward. Somebody's asking, we want to share, yes, there will be a recording made available, and we will make more of the slides available. Some of this needs to be approved by USDA, since this is a United Soybean Board funded project. So the recording will have to be approved. So it might take a little while for these things to be approved and made available. But yes, our goal is to make this as widely available as possible, and then to continue to engage with those who are interested and find ways to continue to make sure that it's going to be successful for you over time, and different ways that you can continue to use the technology in ways that work, or rather use the research that works for you. How do you recommend ingredients derived from genetically engineering be labeled alternative proteins from? So I think there's some work to be done on exactly what needs to be included. Because we need to help people understand, this is generational. You're not likely to be consuming the product that was specifically gene edited, but it's going to be several generations prior to that. So maybe this comes from product, maybe the product that you're consuming has a heritage of being improved through biotechnology, right? So there are different ways to talk about that and then disclose specifically what that means. It's the disclosing specifically what it means that's absolutely essential, but we can talk about that in ways where it helps people understand. And again, the power of analogies is incredible. This is like that. If you're comfortable with this, you should be more comfortable with that. We also know that there's a lot of additional information or a lot of support for technology that is already used in human applications. So the use of gene editing in human medicine provides a great place to start the conversation about gene editing being used in agriculture. More data available on the drivers for trust in plant-based technologies. That information is available. When we can share all of that, we will make that available to you. But right now, we're just able to share the summary with the time we have available today. Should gene-edited products be labeled as bioengineered under federal label, or is excluding it from label deceptive? Consumers don't distinguish between genetic engineering, so it may seem manipulative to leave gene editing out of GMO labeling. So I know that this whole question about how do we share the information is a hot topic among our friends at the Food Marketing Institute. The Food Industry Association, FMI. We're working on it as well. We know that there are others. I think what we know now is that there are lots of different ways that people get access to information. So does it have to be on a label? I don't necessarily know that to be the case today, but we do know that there has to be some kind of disclosure. What's interesting is that the labeling debate in the United States became incredibly contentious. When you look at labeling and how it was done in other countries, it simply was a non-issue. So in Brazil, there's the little bioengineered bug. It's on many products. It's become so ubiquitous, people just simply no longer care about it. The other thing we know is that the commitment to be transparent and to share information carries enormous goodwill. So it's really very helpful when you say, look, we'd like to share this information. We want to make it available to you. You can go to this website. You can use this QR code, lots of different ways for you to get the information. So let's have that conversation. And again, this goes back to some of the challenges that the food manufacturers have talked about. The fact that label space is at a premium. And they'd prefer to save that label space to talk about product attributes and things that they believe are going to be most helpful for them in marketing. So if we can find other ways to provide access to this information that consumers will accept, then we are all better served. So I think that's a conversation that has to continue to be developed in terms of where are we going to make this information available, what's going to be most impactful. But we do know that making that information available to empower consumers to make the choice is absolutely essential to acceptance. Were the results characterized by urban versus rural? They were not. We did look at that by that. Does acceptance means they would buy it or they don't think it should exist? I think it means that they think it would be something that they would be okay with for themselves. I think we'd have to go back in and look to see exactly how that was worded, but I believe that would be the case. Let me jump up here to some other work here, other questions. Give me just a moment to kind of scroll through some of these. I'm trying to get to some of them that are coming through the chat as well as those that are coming through the Q&A, and I'll go to some of those that have been sent earlier. Okay, here's one that was sent in earlier in the week when somebody registered. It seems that each commodity and food group wants to develop outreach to consumers or students. To many times these standalone are not integrated. How can information developed be better utilized and shared? Great question, but I think it's also important to recognize that we historically believe that we needed to have one oracle, one source of all information. And if it wasn't my organization or my association, I felt somehow that we had lost control. I think we now realize, because of the number of channels and the number of sources that consumers go to for information, the more channels and the more sources, the better. To that point, how can we coordinate? How can we make sure we're sharing information in a way that is consistent and helpful to allow consumers to make decisions that are consistent with their values and help build trust in technology overall? This research is one element in that, and there are going to be many others. So we want this research to be used widely for people to use this as often and as many places as they can. We're going to continue to do additional research about what food system stakeholders expect and to share that information as well. So I think if we're able to share our understanding, to share our learning, to share what we know about what builds technology acceptance, and then to empower different organizations to use that in a way that's most effective for them, that's a good strategy. That's a strategy that can be very, very helpful for us as we continue to move forward. Okay, the label is a marketing tool. Absolutely it is. Comment on non-GMO label and things like water, nuts, fruits that have no alternatives. Some are utilized to manipulate the consumers. They are, no question about it. And so part of this conversation with food manufacturers is going to be around this technology helps you achieve some things that are important to you. So for example, if you're a food manufacturer and you've just committed to be carbon neutral over a certain period of time, technology in your supply chain is going to be one of the core tools to help you achieve that. So how can we be supportive of using these tools in a way that helps you meet your objective? Because here's the key. If I'm a food manufacturer, technology in agriculture has little value to me unless it helps me meet some of my objectives. So we have to be able to have the conversation with food system stakeholders about how does this help them meet the objectives that are important to them. The fact that it's helpful for farmers or it's helpful for agriculture is nice, but it's not sufficient for them to be supported. So part of our outreach over the next year with the 60+ food system leaders is to better understand what are their expectations and how can we better meet their needs, because we know that's what's going to be absolutely essential in helping them embrace the technology. We'll continue to see those who are going to use this for marketing campaigns, and there will be a market for GMO-free water. But I think what we're really looking for here are those who are going to be more interested in how can this technology help us build support. We know from some other work we're doing, we're beginning to see some support from some leading organizations and companies to support the responsible use of technology because they know how important it is for them to achieve their specific objectives. Okay, let me drop down here. Do you anticipate a day when most Americans will welcome crops created through gene editing for their benefits to consumers as well as to farmers? Really, really good question. I do anticipate a day when consumers are going to be much more willing to embrace technology. We've seen that over the course of the pandemic as people are really interested in what can technology do to enhance my immune system, to develop vaccines and help protect public health. What else can the technology be used for to help build a better society? There's a growing understanding, awareness, and appreciation and concern, particularly among Gen Z and millennials, about agriculture's impact on the environment. Technology, gene editing, and other technologies provide key tools that can help address some of those really pressing challenges. So I do think there's a real opportunity for us to have this conversation, but the key is we need to understand from this model and other work, what are the best ways to have this conversation? And much of it has to do with what is the concern? What's the problem we're trying to solve? It's wonderful if it benefits farmers, but that in and of itself is not sufficient to generate broad public acceptance. We have to find additional ways to build broader acceptance by making sure we're addressing the issues that are really important to food system stakeholders, Gen Z, millennials, and early adopters who've indicated a willingness to be more accepting of ag technology if it helps address the issues that are most relevant and most important to them. Here's one that came in. Is the success of vaccines, including COVID-19, a significant variable in building trust for other forms of applied science? I believe it is. I think this is an opportunity for us to have that conversation to say, this is the kind of technology that's been very helpful in addressing a global challenge. Technology can help us address other global challenges by making sure we have enough food for everyone, that we're producing the food we need, reducing our impact on the environment, that we are making sure we are really taking good care of our limited resources of soil and water and air. So again, it really helps us have that conversation about the ways we're addressing important social challenges with these technologies. We are about out of time. So before we wrap up for today, I wanted to make sure that I thank the United Soybean Board one more time and to let you know that we are very interested in continuing to share more information with you. My email, apologize for not being on the screen here, is Charlie, CHARLIE .Arnot @foodintegrity.org. Please feel free to email me. You'll be getting follow-up communication for those of you who registered on when information will be available. We want to make as much of this available to you as possible, and ideally to continue to work with those who are developing technologies to find ways to apply this research to continue to increase technology acceptance across all of agriculture. With that, on behalf of the members and the board of directors of the Center for Food Integrity and our funders, the United Soybean Board, who we appreciate very much for their support of this, I want to invite you to continue to stay tuned for more engagement, more conversation as we continue to better understand what are the drivers to consumer acceptance to ag, food, and technology. Thank you again for your time. Have a great rest of your day. Take care.